I never thought a piece of land could teach me more about family than people ever did, but the farm proved me wrong. It wasn't just soil and fences and old barns leaning slightly to the east from decades of wind. It was memory layered on memory, work layered on work, and silence layered on disappointment. When my grandmother passed and left the farm to me, people said I was lucky. What they didn't understand was that inheritance doesn't arrive as a gift. Sometimes it arrives as a responsibility no one else wanted until suddenly they did. The farm had been in our family longer than anyone could clearly remember. Old photographs showed faces whose names were half forgotten, standing proudly in front of barns that no longer existed, holding tools that had rested away decades ago. When I was a child, we visited occasionally. Birthdays, holidays, short summers. Everyone loved the idea of the farm, the stories, the nostalgia, the freedom of running through fields without shoes. But love for the idea never turned into love for the labor. As I grew older, visits became rarer. My parents said it was too far. My sister said there was nothing to do there. Repairs were postponed. Roof leaks ignored. Fences sagged. Fields went untended. My grandmother aged quietly alongside the land, fixing what she could, hiring help when she could afford it, and saying nothing when she couldn't. When she died, the will surprised everyone except her. She left the farm to me. Not to the family, not to be divided, not to be shared. To me. People called it favoritism. They whispered that I must have manipulated her even though I lived the furthest away and visited the least during the final years because of work. What they didn't see were the letters she wrote me, the long phone calls, the way I listened instead of rushing, the way I asked questions about the land when no one else did, the way I sent money quietly when the tractor broke down, the way I showed up without announcing it and spent weekends fixing things instead of posing for photos. The resentment started almost immediately. It didn't explode, it simmered. Subtle comments, jokes that weren't really jokes. Must be nice owning all that land. Guess we know who Grandma loved most. Don't forget it's still the family farm. I never corrected them at first. I was grieving. I didn't want to argue. I told myself time would soften things, that once everyone adjusted, things would calm down. I was wrong. The first year after inheriting the farm was brutal. Repairs alone cost more than I had saved in my adult life. The roof needed replacing, the well needed work, the barn beams were unsafe. I learned quickly that nostalgia doesn't pay contractors. I worked overtime. I delayed vacations. I took on debt. I learned how to fix what I could myself. Weekends disappeared into labor. I showed up in rain and heat and cold. I slept in a drafty farmhouse with creaking floors and memories heavy enough to keep me awake. Not once did my parents offer help. Not once did my sister ask if I needed anything. But they did visit. They visited the way people visit a park, briefly, casually, with assumptions. My sister would bring friends without asking. My parents would talk about our land to neighbors. My mother suggested hosting family gatherings there because it was perfect for it. When I gently asked about help with costs or upkeep, the room always went quiet. Someone would change the subject. Someone would laugh and say, "Oh, come on, it's family." Family, apparently, meant I paid and everyone else enjoyed. I tried setting boundaries softly at first. I asked for notice before visits. I asked people not to bring strangers. I asked them not to make plans involving the property without checking with me. Each request was met with offense disguised as confusion. "Why are you being so sensitive? It's always been ours. Grandma would want us to use it." I started to realize something uncomfortable. They weren't upset because I was being unreasonable. They were upset because I was disrupting a fantasy where responsibility belonged to me and access belonged to them. Then my sister got engaged. The announcement came with excitement, group chats, and immediate assumptions. Within days, my mother mentioned how beautiful the farm would be for a wedding. My sister didn't ask, she told. She talked about where the ceremony would be held, how the barn could be decorated, where guests would park. She spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if my role was to... The seasons kept moving after that, the way they always do when people think their conflicts are permanent. Spring arrived with stubborn green shoots pushing through soil that had been neglected for too long, much like relationships that only begin to heal once neglect is acknowledged. I spent more time on the farm than ever before, not because I was hiding from my family, but because I was finally building something that felt honest. Every repaired fence felt like a boundary reinforced. Every cleared field felt like emotional weight lifting off my chest. Word spread through extended family that I had become difficult, that I had changed. I noticed something interesting about those stories. They always came from people who had never lifted a finger for the farm, never sent money, never asked how I was managing. The ones who quietly respected the decision never needed to announce it. Silence, I learned, can mean understanding just as much as it can mean resentment. My parents didn't visit for a long time after the wedding incident. When they finally did, they walked the land differently. They didn't talk about future plans. They didn't suggest improvements. They observed. They asked questions. Not about hosting events, but about crops, repairs, costs. It was subtle, but it mattered. My mother touched the old barn wall and said softly that she hadn't realized how bad it had gotten before. That sentence carried more weight than any apology could have. I didn't rush forgiveness. I didn't need to. I had learned that forgiveness isn't a performance for others. It's a process you allow yourself when trust has space to rebuild. We talked more honestly that day than we had in years, not about the wedding, but about expectations, about assumptions, about how easily people confuse familiarity with entitlement. My father admitted he had thought the farm would just work itself out because it always had before. I told him it hadn't. It had worked because someone had been quietly carrying it. This time, that someone was me. My sister remained distant. Not hostile, just careful. When she did speak about the farm, she called it your place instead of ours. That small shift mattered more than she probably realized. Once she admitted she hadn't understood how much responsibility came with ownership. She said she thought inheriting land was like inheriting a memory, static, untouchable, endlessly giving. I told her land is alive. It demands. It responds. It reflects how you treat it. She didn't argue. Over time, the farm became something different in the family narrative. It stopped being a backdrop for imagined events and started being recognized as a working place, a place with limits, a place that required permission. That shift didn't happen because I convinced anyone. It happened because I stayed consistent. I didn't punish. I didn't lecture. I simply acted like the owner I was, calmly and without guilt. There were moments of doubt, of course, nights when the house felt too quiet, times when I wondered if standing firm had cost me closeness I could never get back. But then there were mornings when sunlight hit the fields just right, when the air smelled like earth and effort, and I felt grounded in a way I never had before. I realized something then. Peace doesn't come from being liked. It comes from being aligned with yourself. Years later, when people ask about the farm, they usually ask practical questions now. How much work it is, whether it's worth it, if I ever regret it. I tell them the truth. It's hard. It's expensive. It demands more than it gives some days. But it taught me how to stop shrinking to make others comfortable. It taught me that boundaries aren't walls. They're doors with locks, and you decide who gets a key. Sometimes family still jokes about weddings and events, but there's an understanding underneath it now, a respect that wasn't there before. Not because I demanded it loudly, but because I proved my no wasn't temporary. It wasn't emotional. It was rooted. The farm still carries history, but it no longer carries everyone's expectations, just mine. And that made all the difference. Time has a way of revealing which decisions were made out of fear and which were made out of truth. As the years settled into a quieter rhythm, the farm stopped being the center of conflict and became something else entirely, a measure. A measure of how far I'd come and how much I was willing to protect what I'd built, not just with my hands, but with my resolve. I began inviting fewer people, but the visits meant more. Friends who came, asked before arriving, brought food without being told, offered help without making it a transaction. We spent long evenings sitting on the porch, listening to insects hum and wind pass through the trees. Those moments felt earned. They were simple, unperformative, and real. No one talked about what the farm could be used for. They talked about what it already was. My sister's children grew older, and when they visited, they treated the land gently. They asked where they could run, where they shouldn't. They listened. Watching them, I realized that boundaries don't create distance when they're clear. They create safety. Children understood that instinctively. Adults sometimes take longer. One autumn, my sister stayed behind after a visit while the kids ran ahead. She stood near the fence line, looking out at the fields. She didn't apologize outright, but she said something that mattered. She said she hadn't realized how often she took things for granted until something she assumed was hers wasn't. She said losing the farm as an option for her wedding felt like rejection at first, but now she saw it as a lesson she hadn't wanted to learn. I nodded. We didn't dwell on it. Understanding doesn't need ceremony. My parents aged into a softer version of themselves, less certain, more observant. My mother started bringing old photo albums when she visited, not to reclaim the past, but to share it. We'd sit at the kitchen table and look through images of people who once worked this land with hands rougher than ours. She admitted she had confused access with love for a long time. I told her many people do. She squeezed my hand and said she was proud of how I handled things, even when she hadn't been at first. That moment felt heavier than praise. It felt like closure. The farm itself changed me in quieter ways. I became more patient, more selective. I stopped over-explaining my choices in every part of my life. At work, in friendships, in relationships, I noticed I no longer felt the need to justify why something mattered to me. If someone respected it, they stayed. If they didn't, they drifted, and that was okay. Sometimes on long evenings, I think about how easily I could have said yes back then, how much applause I would have gotten in the moment, how many compliments about generosity and family loyalty. I also think about the damage that would have followed, the resentment I would have swallowed, the unspoken message that my labor, my investment, my limits didn't matter. That realization always brings me back to the same truth. Peace delayed is not peace earned. The farm didn't just survive, it thrived, slowly and imperfectly, like anything worth keeping. It became a place where I could hear my own thoughts, where silence wasn't awkward, where no one expected more than I was willing to give. It stood as proof that inheritance isn't about what you receive, but about what you're willing to carry forward without losing yourself. And when people ask now if I'd ever allow a wedding there, I smile, not because the answer has changed, but because I know it no longer matters. The farm isn't a test anymore. It's a home. Eventually, the need to explain everything faded away. The story stopped being something I had to defend and became something I simply lived. The farm woke each morning whether anyone approved of my choices or not. The sun rose. The fields breathed, the work waited patiently, indifferent to family opinions and past arguments. There was comfort in that constancy. On the anniversary of my grandmother's passing, I walked the land alone. I followed the paths she used to take, the ones worn smooth by years of habit. I stopped at the spot where she used to stand at dusk, watching the light settle over the fields. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of expectation or conflict attached to that place. I felt gratitude. Not for the inheritance itself, but for the lesson it carried. She hadn't just left me land. She had left me permission to choose differently, to stop being taken for granted, to honor effort instead of entitlement. Family gatherings eventually resumed, smaller and quieter. No one made plans without asking anymore. No one spoke in assumptions. When people came, they came with respect, and when they didn't, the farm remained unchanged, steady and whole, no longer dependent on anyone's approval to justify its existence. I realized then that standing my ground hadn't broken my family the way they feared. It had reshaped it. The relationships that survived did so honestly. The ones that faded were built on expectations that were never fair to begin with. That clarity brought a kind of peace I hadn't known before. As the years continued, the farm became less of a symbol and more of a rhythm: work, rest, seasons, repair, a life that asked for presence, not permission. I stopped measuring success by how much I could give others and started measuring it by how well I could care for what was entrusted to me. And in the quiet moments, when the land stretched out before me and the air settled into stillness, I understood something fully at last. Saying no didn't make me cold, it made me free.